The House on the Cliff. Chapter 4. The Chase in the Bay. The boys stared at one another in bewilderment. "I know my toolbox was full when I left home," said Frank. "And so was mine," came from Joe. "I was using the pliers just before we started out." "Where could they have gone?" "They must have been stolen while the motorcycles were in the shed at the Palooka place," Chet suggested. "That's the only time that they could have been taken," declared Frank. "It was the only time they were left unguarded." Joe was frankly puzzled. "But we didn't see anyone around the place," said Jerry. "No, but there was someone there. We heard them shriek and laugh. Someone stole those tools while we were in the house." "It's some kind of practical joke. That's what I'm beginning to think," declared Frank. "Let's go back and get those tools." "Not on your life," objected Jerry decisively. "It's a little too much for me. First of all, we hear these shrieks, and then the house almost comes down round our ears, and now we find that the tools have been stolen by somebody we didn't see. We're safer away from there." Biff Hooper nodded in agreement. "That's what I think. There's something odd about that house. We'll get into trouble if we go butting in again." "But we want our tools." "Good night!" Chet exclaimed. "Perhaps mine are gone too." He ran out of the shed, over to the road, and hastily examined the toolbox on his motorcycle. Then he straightened up with an audible sigh of relief. "Thank goodness they're here. Guess whoever took the others figured he had enough." "I'm going back," declared Frank. "If you do, you'll have to excuse me," Chet said. "You're welcome to use my tools to fix your machine, but I won't go back with you." "Me neither," chimed in Jerry and Biff simultaneously. Frank and Joe were silent. They wanted to go back to Palooka Place and investigate the matter further, but they didn't want to break up the party, so they decided it would be better policy to remain with their companions. "All right," Frank said. "Lend me a pair of the pliers, and I'll have this trouble fixed up in no time." He went over to Chet's motorcycle and got the desired tools, and then he began to tinker with his machine. It was only a minor defect, and in a few minutes work sufficed to repair the damage. In the meantime, it was apparent that the rain was letting up, and by the time the Hardy boys took their motorcycles out of the shed and regained the road, it had died away to a mere drizzle. "This has been some holiday," Chet murmured, as he mounted his motorcycle again. "I'm going home. Jerry, you and Biff better come up to my place for dinner. How about you and Joe, Frank?" "Thanks just the same. We couldn't. We promised we'd be back home this afternoon." "There's a side road turns here that makes a nice shortcut to our farm. I guess I'll go that way. There should be room for the three on this bike, with a little crowding." Jerry and Biff Hooper climbed on the motorcycle with Chet Morton and started off. The Hardy boys followed on their own machines until they reached the side road about 100 yards away. There the others left them, after shouting goodbye. Frank and Joe watched Chet's motorcycle, heavily loaded, disappear into the mist that hovered over the road, and then they prepared to continue their journey back to Bayport. The shore road dipped at that point and wound down along the edge of the bay in the deep spiral, which brought them at one point almost back to the cliff at the top of which the Palooka place was located, although by now they were nearer the water's edge. From there the road sloped directly down to the shore, then ran along the edge of the bay and in towards the city. Frank looked up towards the top of the cliff that loomed high above them. They could not see the Palooka place from where they were, as it was on the high ground and almost masked by trees, but the mystery of the place still preyed on their minds. "I'd like to go back there yet," said Frank suddenly. "That affair of the tools has me guessing." "Me too. But I think we'd better go on home. We can come back some other time and look for them. One minute I think it was only a practical joke of some kind, and the next minute I think it's something a whole lot deeper than that. There's something strange going on up there." There were sure a lot of strange things going on when we struck the place, that's certain. I can hear those shrieks yet. Well, I guess you're right, Joe. We may as well go home. But I'd like to get to the bottom of it. Whoever stole those tools made quick work of it. We weren't in the house very long. It proves that it wasn't a ghost anyway. I never did believe in ghost theory. No human being took those tools, and he was watching us too. He saw us put the bikes in the shed, and he took the tools while we were in the house. Unless they were taken after we left the bikes under the tree in the first place. He wouldn't have had time. We only stepped into the front room, and then we all came out after that for a shriek. No, the tools were taken when the bikes were in the shed. The boys rode on. The rain had ceased now, but the road was greasy, and they had to call on all their skills to keep from skidding as they drove down the steep road towards the bay. So they did not talk again until they reached the more level highway at the shore. A sound out on the bay attracted Frank's attention. He looked out over the rolling sweep of water. He could see a powerful motorboat plunging through the waves about a quarter of a mile out. It was just coming into view around the base of the cliff, and as Frank looked, he saw the nose of still another boat emerging into sight. Each craft was traveling at high speed. "Looks like a race," remarked Joe. The Hardy boys stopped their motorcycles and watched the two boats, but it was soon apparent that this was no friendly speed contest. The boat in the lead was zigzagging in a peculiar manner, and the pursuing craft was rapidly overhauling it. The staccato roar of the powerful boats was borne to the lad's ears by the wind. "See, the other boat is chasing it," Frank exclaimed. He had caught sight of the figures of two men standing in the bow of the pursuing craft. They were waving their arms frantically. The first boat turned as though it were about to head inshore at the cliff, and then, apparently, the helmsman changed his mind, for at once the nose of the boat pointed out into the open bay again, but the moment of hesitation had given the pursuers the chance they wanted, and swiftly the gap between the racing crafts grew smaller and smaller. The Hardy boys saw that there was but one man in the foremost craft. He was bent over the wheel. In the other boat they caught sight of one figure who had snatched up an object that appeared to be a rifle. To their amazement, they saw him aim at the man in the leading craft. Then across the water they heard the sharp report. The lone figure in the first boat dropped out of sight. Whether he had been hit or not, the boys could not tell, but the craft did not slacken speed. Instead, it still continued to race madly through the waves. But the pursuers rapidly drew closer until at last the boats were running side by side. They were so close together that it appeared as if a collision were imminent. "The whole crowd of them will be killed if they aren't careful," muttered Frank. Then, just when it seemed that both boats must crash together, the pursuing craft, as though it had given up the chase, veered abruptly away and headed out towards the middle of the bay. The speed of the other boat decreased. The roar of its exhaust became intermittent. "Engine trouble," suggested Joe. But there was more than engine trouble. With startling violence, a sheet of flame leapt high into the air from the motorboat. There was a stunning explosion and a dense puff of smoke. Bits of wreckage were thrown high into the air, and in the midst of it all, the Hardy boys, horrified, saw the figure of the man they had noticed before, as he had hurled into the water. The whole boat was swiftly ablaze. Hardly had the wreckage begun to fall back into the water with spasmodic patterings and splashes than the craft was in flames from bow to stern. "Look!" shouted Frank. "He's still alive!" The man on the boat had been killed by neither the rifle shot nor the explosion. They could see him struggling in the water, not far from the blazing craft. His head was a dark oval above the water, and he was slowly trying to swim ashore. "He'll never make it," gasped Joe. "We'll have to try to save him," answered his brother. Chapter 5. The Rescue. The Hardy Boys knew that they had no time to lose. It was evident from the struggle of the man in the water that he was no expert swimmer. So far he had not seen the boys, but they could hear him shouting for help, possibly thinking, however, that it was in vain, for he was in a lonely part of the bay, and the nearest farmhouse outside of the deserted Palooka place was more than half a mile down the road. "Quick!" shouted Frank. "I see a rowboat up on the shore." His sharp eyes had discerned a small boat almost hidden in a little cove some distance away at the bottom of a steep declivity that was of the beginning of the cliff. It could not be reached by going along the shore, and the boys saw that they could have to go along the high ground and then descend to it, for a huge rock that jutted out of the deep water cut the cove off from the more open part of the beach. They left their motorcycles on the side of the road and hurried back up the slope, then cut down across a narrow strip of weeds and grass until they came to the top of the declivity. They could still see the victim of the explosion struggling in the waves. The man had seized a piece of wreckage and was able to remain afloat, but the boys knew it was only a matter of time before his strength would give out. "I wonder if he's anybody we know," came from his brother. "It isn't likely." Frank reached out suddenly and caught hold of Joe's arm. "Look out there, or you may break a leg." "It certainly is mighty slippery," answered Joe, as he managed to regain his footing. He had come close to going heels over head on the rocks. Slipping and scrambling, they made their way down the slope towards the little cove. Rocks went rolling and tumbling ahead of them. The distance was only a few yards, but the slope was steep, and a false step might result in broken bones. But they reached the bottom in safety, and there they came upon the rowboat. It was battered and old, but evidently still seaworthy. "Into the water with her," said Frank. They seized the boat, and the keel grated on the shingles as the little craft was launched. Swiftly they fixed the oars in the locks, and then they scrambled into their places. They began to row with strong, steady strokes out towards the man in the bay. He had seen them, and was now shouting to them to hurry. "He'd be better off if he kept quiet," Joe said. "He's only wasting his strength." Evidently this thought occurred to the victim of the wreck, or else he was becoming weaker, for his cries died away and the boys did not hear him again. Frank thought he may have gone beneath the waves, and he cast a quick look round, but the fellow was still in view, clinging desperately to his bit of wreckage. The motorboat in the background was still blazing fiercely. Flames were shooting high in the air, and the craft was plainly doomed. A great pillar of smoke was rolling into the sky from the burning boat. As for the other motorboat, Frank could hear the roar of its exhaust as it continued its flight out into the bay. For a while he could see its dim shape. Then he turned round once in a while, but then the fleeing boat disappeared into the mist and the gloom. The boys exerted all their strength, and the little rowboat fairly leapt over the waves. Both were good oarsmen, and it was not long before they had drawn close to the man in the water, but it looked as though they would be too late. When they were only a few yards away, Frank looked round to shout encouragement to the victim of the wreck. Even as he looked, he saw the man wearily give up his grasp on the piece of wreckage to which he had been clinging. Frank had a glimpse of the white face and the despairing eyes, and then the man sank slowly beneath the waves. "He's drowning, Joe!" shouted Frank, as he bent to his oars again. With a mighty effort, they brought the boat close by the place where the man had gone down. Frank leapt to the side of the boat and peered down into the depths. He began taking off his coat, preparing to dive into the rescue. Then the fellow came to the surface again, gasping for breath, but so weak that he could scarcely make a struggle. He emerged from the water right beside the boat, and Frank leaned over, grasped him by the hair. This sufficed to prevent the man from sinking for the second time, and Frank managed to get a grip on the collar of his coat. Then, with Joe helping, and in imminent danger of upsetting the boat, he managed to drag the stranger to the side of the craft. The fellow was a dead weight, for he had lapsed into unconsciousness. Then Frank seized him, but however they contrived to get him into the boat, and there he lay, sprawled helplessly, more dead than alive. "We'd better get him to shelter some place and revive him," said Joe. "We can't do much for him here. How about that farmhouse down the bay?" "Very place. Where is it?" They finally located the farmhouse, a snug little building back of the main road, some distance down the bay. It meant considerable rowing, but there was a life at stake. The blazing motorboat near by was a roaring mass of flames. Then it began to sink beneath the waves. There was a great hissing sound and a heavy cloud of steam as the craft sank lower and lower into the water, its blazing embers blackening to the touch of the sea. Swiftly, at last, the boat disappeared. Its stern seemed to hesitate for a moment, and then it slid quickly down into the waves, and the only trace was a widening pool of oil, scattered wreckage on the surface of the water. But the hardy boys were too busy to give more than passing notice to the spectacle. Their immediate problem was to get the stranger under shelter. Frank decided that there was no necessity for first aid. The man had been conscious when he rose from the water the first time, so there could not be much water in his lungs. He had simply given in to exhaustion and fatigue resulting from his long struggle in the waves. They headed the boat down the bay in a direct line with the little farmhouse, which they could see nestling among the trees. They had already spent much energy in rowing out to rescue the stranger, but they fell to the new task with a will. Rowing with machine-like precision, they felt the little boat respond to every effort, and it fairly leapt along. This time they had the wind and the waves with them, and they made good time. The man they had rescued lay face downward in the bottom of the boat. He was a slim, black-haired fellow. His clothes, which, of course, were soaked with water, were cheap and worn, the sleeves being frayed at the cuffs. They could not see his face, but they judged him to be young. He was still unconscious. Frank let Joe take his oar for a moment, and crouched down beside the stranger. He turned the man over, and the limp form lolled about as helplessly as a bag of salt. As they had surmised, he was a young fellow, with sharp, clean-cut features. He wore a cheap shirt, open at the throat. Frank pressed his ear to the fellow's chest and listened for signs of life. Finally, he straightened up, with a matter of satisfaction. "His heart's beating all right," he told Joe. "He's alive, at any rate. Just all in. He'll come around after a while." He returned to his oar, and a little boat skimmed about the waves on towards the farmhouse in the distance. The boys rowed until the muscles of their arms were aching, but at last they drew near the shore, and finally the pebbles grated underneath the keel. Frank leapt out and dragged the boat part way up on the beach. Then between them they carried the unconscious man up the rocky shore towards the farmhouse. They found a path that led through a field up to the back door of the house, and although their burden was heavy, they managed to carry the still figure limp and motionless across the field. A gaunt, kindly-faced woman came hurrying out of the house at their approach, and from the orchard nearby came a man in overalls. The farmer and his wife had seen them. "This man was nearly drowned out on the bay," exclaimed Frank. "We saw your house. Bring him in," boomed the farmer. "Bring him indoors." The woman ran ahead of them and held the door open. With the farmer giving aid, the boys carried the unconscious man into the house and placed him on the couch in the comfortably furnished living room. The farmer's wife glanced dubiously at the stream of water that dripped from the victim's clothes, for she was a tidy woman, and she had just scrubbed the floor that morning. But her better nature overcame her housewifely instincts, and she hastened out of the kitchen to prepare a hot drink. "Best rub his hands," suggested the farmer. He was a burly man with a black beard. "It'll bring the blood back to his cheeks. One of you take off his boots, and we'll wrap his feet up in warm flannels." For the next 5 minutes the house was a scene of excitement as the farmer and his wife bustled about, and the Hardy boys rubbed industriously at the hands and feet of the unconscious man, trying to restore him to consciousness. At last there was a sign of reviving life. The man on the couch stirred feebly, his eyelids fluttered, his lips moved, but no words came. Then the eyes opened, and the man stared at them as though he was in a daze. "Where am I?" he muttered faintly. "You're safe," Frank assured him. "You're with friends. Pretty near crashed in, didn't I?" "Yes, you pretty nearly drowned, but you're all right now." "It was Snakely," said the stranger, as though talking to himself. "Snakely got me, the rat." Chapter 6. Snakely. At that moment the farmer's wife appeared, bringing a drink of hot ginger and water, which the man on the couch gulped down gratefully. "We'll put him in the spare room, Mabel," declared the man. "He needs a good warm bed, more'n anything else just now. I'll look after him, if these boys'll help me." I think I was shot," muttered the stranger. He motioned weakly towards the side. Frank leaned over. "Why, there's blood on his coat!" he exclaimed. A hasty examination showed that the stranger was right. There was a bullet wound in his right side. It was evidently not serious, merely a flesh wound, but it had bled freely, and the man was weakened. Gently the boys helped remove his clothes, and with warm water and a sponge the farmer bathed the wound. The bullet had passed right through the fellow's coat after searing a path across his side. Disinfectant was then applied, and the stranger gritted his teeth with pain after the bandages were put in place. "Now we can put him to bed. Can you walk, stranger?" "I'm afraid I can't." "All right, then. We'll carry you. Give me a hand, boys." Between them, they carried the wounded man upstairs into a plain but comfortably furnished room. Here he was put to bed and covered with warm blankets. With a sigh of relief, he closed his eyes. "He's weak from the loss of blood." "That's mostly what's the matter with him," the farmer said. "We'll let him have a good sleep." They left the room, and when they went out into the kitchen again, the Hardy boys told the farmer and his wife the strange adventure they had just been through. The farmer listened thoughtfully. "Odd," he observed. "Mighty odd." Then, glancing significantly at his wife, he said, "What do you think of it, Mabel?" "I think the same as you, Bill. You know it. Most likely it's been another of them smuggling mix-ups." The farmer nodded. "I've an idea it's something like that." "Smuggling?" exclaimed Frank. "Sure. There's quite a bit of smuggling goes on round Barmit Bay, you know. Leastways, there has been in the past few months. It's been my suspicions, anyway. I've seen too many motorboats out in the bay of late, and I've heard too many of 'em prowlin' round at night. If it's not smuggling, it's some other kind of unlawful business. Do you think this fellow may have been shot in some kind of smuggling?" The farmer shrugged. "Maybe a quarrel. Maybe I ain't saying nothing. It ain't safe to say anything when you don't know for certain. But I wouldn't be a mite surprised." Mr. and Mrs. Kane, as they introduced themselves, were just about to have dinner, and they invited the Hardy boys to stay. This the lads were glad to do, but they were very tired by their exertions of the morning, and were already feeling the pangs of hunger. They sat down to the simple but ample meal, typical farm fare of roast beef, baked pork, and beans, with creamy mashed potatoes topped off with a rich lemon pie, frothy with meringue, and fragrant coffee. During the meal they discussed the strange affairs of the bay. The Hardy boys did not mention their experience at the Palooka place, for they had learned that one of the chief requests of the good detective is to keep his ears open and his mouth shut, to hear more than he tells. "I'd like to find out more about this affair," said Frank, when the meal was concluded, and Mr. Kane sat back luxuriously in his chair and puffed at his pipe. "Perhaps that fellow is awake now." "Wouldn't do any harm to see. You might ask him some questions. I'm just as curious about it as yourself." They went upstairs. The stranger was sleeping, and when they looked into the room, but the slight noise they had made awakened him, and he gazed at them dully. "Feeling better?" Joe asked. "Oh, yes," replied the stranger weakly. I have lost a lot of blood, though." "That was when they shot you, just before the boat blew up," said Frank. The man in bed nodded, but said nothing. "What's your name, stranger?" asked Mr. Kane bluntly. The man in the bed hesitated a moment. "Jones," he said at last. It was so evidently a false name that the Hardy boys glanced at one another, and the farmer scratched his chin doubtfully. "How come you be in such a mess as this?" he asked at last. "What were they shooting at you for?" "Don't ask me, please," said the mysterious Jones. "I can't tell you. I can't tell you anything." "I suppose you know these young fellers saved your life." "Yes, I know, and I'm very grateful, but don't ask me any questions. I can't tell you anything about it." "You won't even tell them? Not after they saved your life?" Jones shook his head stubbornly. "I can't explain anything about it. Please go away. Let me sleep." Frank and Joe signaled to the farmer that it would be best if they withdrew, so they left the room and closed the door. Then they went back downstairs. The farmer was grumbling to himself. "I'm hanged if he ain't the most close-mouthed lad I've ever seen," he declared. "You saved his life, and he won't tell why he came to be racing round by the bay in a motor-boat with fellows shooting at him." "He must have some good reason." "It's his own business, after all," reflected Frank. "We can't force him to explain anything." "He's in with some smugglers. That's what I think," declared Mr. Kane with conviction. "Guess we had better get back home. Do you mind keeping him here? We can have him moved to a hospital." "Smuggler or not, he stays here until he gets better. Nobody ever said Bill Kane turned a sick man out of doors, and nobody ever will. He stays here until he gets better." "We'll come back in a day or so and see how he's getting along," Joe promised. "He'll have the best of care here. Whether he's smuggler or not, that he's been mixed up in, it doesn't matter. My wife and I will look after him." The Hardy boys arranged to have the rowboat return to its mooring place, and then took their leaving of the good-hearted farmer and his wife, and made their way out of the road. Then they went back to the place where they had left their motorcycles, and in a short while they were speeding again on their return to Bayport. "The fellow is certainly an odd duck," remarked Joe, as he and his brother motored towards home. "I'll say he is," said Frank. "There's something mighty odd about all this. And don't you forget it." It was mid-afternoon when they turned their motorcycles into the driveway beside the Hardy home, and after they had put their motorcycles in the garage, they went into the house. They found their father, Fenton Hardy, in his den just off the library. He was never too busy to talk to his sons, and when they came in he put down the papers he was studying and leaned back in his chair. "Well, what have you been up to these days?" he inquired, smiling. "We've had a real adventure this time, Dad," Frank told him. "We were out to the old Palooka place with some of the fellows. That's the haunted house, isn't it? See any ghosts?" The boys looked at one another. "No, we didn't see any ghosts exactly," said Joe, "but—" "You don't mean to tell me you heard some?" Fenton Hardy threw back his head and laughed with delight. "You may laugh, but some mighty odd things happened out there," insisted Joe. Whereupon the brothers told their father the strange experiences at the deserted farmhouse. But Mr. Hardy refused to take them seriously. "Some of your school chums playing a joke on you," he said, dismissing the affair. "They'll be laughing their heads off about it right now." "But how do you account for the toolbox being robbed?" "They just did that to make it look like it was a mystery. Probably they will hand you back your tools at school on Monday just to prove their story." This aspect of the situation had not occurred to the boys. They began to look a bit sheepish. If it had been the work of a practical joker, it was only natural that they would seek something definite whereby to prove the fact that they had been at the farmhouse. "Gosh, we'll never hear the end of it." "If that's the case," Joe said. "Oh well, we'll just have to take it in good part. We didn't tell you about what happened on the way home." "Tell me about it, Frank." "Another adventure." "A real one? No practical joke about this?" Frank whereupon told their father about the two motorboats in Beaumont Bay, about the chase and the resulting explosion. He modestly underestimated their own part in the rescue of the victims and the wreckage, but Fenton Hardy nodded his head in satisfaction as the story went on. Good work," he muttered. "You saved the fellow's life, anyway. And it looks as though you've stumbled onto a mysterious bit of business on the motorboat chase. What did the man say his name was?" "Jones," answered Frank doubtfully. Fenton Hardy raised his eyebrows. "Of course. There are lots of Joneses in the world. It might be his real name, but more than likely it isn't." "Would he tell you anything about the reason for the chase? Did you question him?" "He wouldn't tell us anything at all. We made a few inquiries, but he said he couldn't explain." "Still more mysterious," reflected the detective. "Do you think he will talk when he gets better?" "I'm afraid not. He seemed quite determined not to tell us anything about himself or about the man who was chasing him." "Don't you remember, Frank," exclaimed Joe, "when we brought him into the house, just as he became conscious again, what was it he said?" "Oh, yes, I had forgotten. He said Snakely got me the rat, whatever that means." "Snakely!" exclaimed Fenton Hardy, starting up. "Are you sure that he said Snakely? Are you sure that was the name?" "I'm certain. Aren't you, Joe?" "Yes, that was the name, all right." "Well, that does give us something to work on," the detective said. "Probably you've never heard of Snakely, but I have." "Who is he?" asked Frank. "Ganny Snakely, a noted criminal. He's a smuggler, one of the leaders of the ring of smugglers who brings opium in and other drugs. It is possible that he might bring in drugs into the country at Beaumont Bay.